Some weddings begin with love, others begin with silence. But this one began with two people standing at the altar who could barely stand the sight of each other. Clara Bennett felt the weight of 1,000 watching eyes as she stood beneath the soft golden lights of St. Matthew's Cathedral in Manhattan, her hands steady even though everything inside her felt like a storm. The polished marble floors reflected the glow of the chandeliers above, and the air carried the faint scent of lilies and polished wood, the kind of expensive calm that only powerful families could afford. To every guest seated in the long rows of white chairs, it looked like the wedding of the year. The bride in a perfect ivory gown. The groom in a tailored black suit that probably cost more than most people's rent for a month. Cameras were ready. Smiles were expected. But Clara Bennett wasn't smiling. Not even close. Beside her stood Adrian Russo, the man she had agreed to marry only hours earlier, a man whose reputation filled rooms before he ever walked into them. Adrian stood perfectly still, tall and composed, his dark suit fitted with quiet precision, his expression unreadable. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look happy. If anything, he looked like a man attending a business negotiation rather than his own wedding. Clara slowly turned her head toward him, her voice so low that no one in the cathedral could hear it. "I hate you," she whispered under her breath, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Adrian didn't look surprised. In fact, the corner of his mouth moved just slightly, not quite a smile, not quite amusement, something colder and more controlled. "Good," he murmured quietly enough that only she could hear. "That will keep you alive." The words sent a ripple of confusion through Clara's thoughts, but the priest's voice rose before she could respond. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Adrian Russo and Clara Bennett." The guests shifted gently in their seats, elegant suits brushing against silk dresses as phones lifted discreetly to capture the moment. From the outside, it looked like the joining of two powerful families, a strategic alliance wrapped in white roses and polished tradition. But Clara knew the truth, and so did Adrian. This wedding had nothing to do with love. It had nothing to do with celebration. It was an arrangement built on urgency, secrecy, and a promise that neither of them had time to fully explain. Clara stared straight ahead at the tall stained glass windows glowing with afternoon sunlight, trying to steady her breathing. 12 hours earlier, she had been living a normal life, worrying about rent, answering emails, planning the next ordinary week of her life. Now she was standing beside one of the most powerful men in New York, wearing a ring that felt heavier than gold had any right to feel. Adrian Russo finally turned his head slightly, his dark eyes scanning the rows of guests with quiet precision. To most people, it might have looked like the calm gaze of a confident groom. But there was something else there too, something sharper, something watchful. Clara noticed the subtle way his attention moved across the room, pausing for a fraction of a second longer than necessary on certain faces in the crowd. She leaned toward him again, unable to stop herself. "Why are you really doing this?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. His posture remained calm, his hands relaxed at his sides, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome. "Because right now," he said softly, "this is the only way to make sure no one in this room gets close enough to hurt you." The silence inside the cathedral stretched for a moment after Adrian spoke, and Clara felt the strange weight of his words settle in her chest like a question she could not yet answer. The priest continued speaking in the calm, ceremonial rhythm of a wedding that appeared perfectly ordinary, but Clara could barely focus on the words. Her attention kept drifting back to the man standing beside her. Adrian Russo did not look like someone who needed protection from anyone, yet he had just claimed that this marriage was meant to protect her. Clara slowly exhaled and stared forward at the rows of guests again. Elegant suits, polished shoes, expensive watches catching the afternoon light. To most people in the room, this looked like a celebration between two powerful families, a moment meant to be photographed and admired. But Clara knew something none of them did. She had met Adrian Russo only once before today, and that meeting had ended, with her walking out of the room convinced that he was the most cold and arrogant man she had ever encountered. 6 months earlier, she had stepped into a tall glass office building in Midtown Manhattan, carrying a folder of financial reports and absolutely no intention of meeting anyone named Adrian Russo. At that time, she had been working as a junior analyst for a consulting firm that handled contracts for several large businesses in the city. Her job had been simple: review documents, verify numbers, leave the meetings to people who enjoyed negotiating across polished tables. But that afternoon had been different. A last-minute request had pulled her into a meeting she was never supposed to attend. Clara still remembered the moment the conference room door opened and Adrian Russo walked in. The entire room had shifted the instant he appeared. Conversations stopped. Chairs straightened. People who had been speaking confidently just seconds earlier suddenly chose their words more carefully. Adrian had crossed the room without rushing, his presence quiet but impossible to ignore. His dark suit was perfectly fitted, his posture relaxed, and his expression carried the calm focus of someone who was used to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. Clara had watched him for exactly 10 seconds before deciding she already disliked him. He had greeted the executives politely, taken his seat at the head of the table, and listened to the presentation without interrupting once. But when one of the senior managers attempted to explain a complicated financial clause, Adrian had lifted his hand slightly and corrected the explanation in a tone so calm that it somehow made the mistake feel even more embarrassing. Clara had not been able to stop herself. "Excuse me," she had said from the far end of the table, surprising everyone including herself. "That interpretation is not accurate." Every head in the room had turned toward her. Adrian had turned as well, studying her with a quiet curiosity that felt less like annoyance and more like careful evaluation. Clara had stood up, walked to the display screen, and pointed to a specific paragraph in the document. The language clearly states that the liability falls on the supplier, not the distributor, she had explained steadily. If this contract moves forward as written, your company absorbs the entire financial risk. The room had gone completely silent. Adrian had watched her for several seconds before leaning back slightly in his chair. "And who exactly are you?" he had asked. "Clara Bennett," she had replied without hesitation. "Then you are the first honest person in this room today," Adrian had said calmly, his gaze still fixed on her. Clara had folded her arms and answered with equal calm. "Or maybe I am just the first person here who is not impressed by your reputation." The memory of that meeting lingered in Clara's mind like a sharp echo as she stood inside the cathedral, listening to the priest's steady voice while guests watched the ceremony unfold. 6 months ago, she had believed that moment in the conference room would be the first and last time she ever crossed paths with Adrian Russo. She had walked out of the building that afternoon convinced she had embarrassed one of the most powerful men in New York, and she had fully expected to receive a polite email from her supervisor reminding her to stay quiet during executive meetings. Instead, something very different happened. Adrian had not argued with her in the conference room. He had not raised his voice or challenged her explanation. Instead, he had simply studied her for a long moment with that same unreadable calm expression he wore now at the altar. Then he had asked the room a single question. Why was the only accurate explanation delivered by the youngest person in this meeting? No one had answered. The senior executives had avoided eye contact while the presentation continued awkwardly, but Clara had already gathered her folder and returned to her seat, convinced she had said enough. The meeting ended 15 minutes later, and Clara had been halfway down the hallway when she heard a calm voice behind her. "Miss Bennett." She had turned and seen Adrian Russo standing several steps away, his hands relaxed in the pockets of his coat, watching her with the same quiet focus he seemed to give everything. "I do not believe we finished our conversation," he had said. Clara had crossed her arms instinctively. "I was not aware we were having one." Adrian had stepped closer, not aggressively, but with the steady confidence of someone who did not rush anything. "You corrected a financial clause in front of an entire board of executives," he had replied calmly. "Most people would have chosen silence." Clara had shrugged. Most people were wrong. For a brief second, something almost like amusement had crossed Adrian's face before disappearing again. "Then you value accuracy more than comfort," he had said. Clara had answered without hesitation. "I value honesty more than reputation." Adrian had studied her for another moment, as though measuring something invisible. Finally, he had said something she did not expect. "That is rare in this city." Clara had assumed that was the end of the conversation. She had turned toward the elevators, ready to return to the predictable world of spreadsheets and emails, but Adrian had spoken again before she could walk away. "Miss Bennett, if someone offered you a choice between safety and truth, Which one would you choose? Clara had paused at the elevator doors, puzzled by the question. Truth, she had answered simply. Adrian had nodded once, as though confirming something only he understood. Good, he had said quietly. Because sooner or later the truth has a way of finding people whether they are ready or not. At the time, Clara had assumed it was just an unusual remark from a powerful businessman with an unusual personality. She had stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and forgotten about Adrian Russo entirely. She had no way of knowing that 6 months later she would be standing beside him at a wedding altar, while he quietly promised that marrying him might be the only thing keeping her safe. The priest's voice continued to echo gently through the cathedral, but Clara Bennett barely heard a single word as the memory of the past months settled over her, like a slow realization she still had not fully processed. After that brief conversation in the office building lobby, Adrian Russo had disappeared from her life just as quickly as he had entered it. Weeks passed, then months, and Clara returned to the steady rhythm of her normal routine. She worked long hours reviewing financial reports, spent quiet evenings in her small Brooklyn apartment, and gradually forgot about the strange question Adrian had asked her near the elevator. Life felt predictable again, almost boring in the way that ordinary safety often does. Then everything changed on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Clara had just finished reviewing a set of contract summaries when her supervisor appeared beside her desk looking unusually tense. Miss Bennett, someone is here. To see you, he said quietly. Clara assumed it was a client with a document question, but when she stepped into the hallway, she immediately stopped walking. Adrian Russo stood near the window at the far end of the corridor, looking exactly as composed as the last time she had seen him. His dark suit was tailored perfectly, his posture relaxed, and his attention focused calmly on the city skyline beyond the glass. The moment he turned toward her, Clara felt that same strange awareness she had experienced in the conference room months earlier, as if the atmosphere of the hallway had quietly shifted. Mr. Russo, she said carefully, unsure why one of the most influential men in New York would be standing outside her office on an ordinary weekday. Adrian gave a polite nod, his expression thoughtful rather than formal. Miss Bennett, I apologize for arriving without notice. Clara crossed her arms instinctively. That depends on what you are here for. Adrian studied her for a moment before answering. I am here because your name has appeared somewhere it should not have. The words sounded simple, but they carried a weight Clara did not immediately understand. My name appears on plenty of financial reports, she replied cautiously. Adrian shook his head slightly. Not those records. Clara felt a small ripple of unease move through her thoughts. What kind of records are we talking about? Adrian glanced briefly down the hallway, ensuring they were alone before speaking again. The kind connected to a group of people who believe you know something valuable. Clara blinked in confusion. I do not know anything about anyone like that. Adrian nodded slowly, as if he expected that answer. I believe you. Unfortunately, they may not. The quiet certainty in his voice made the hallway suddenly feel colder. Clara took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. If someone believes that, then they are mistaken. Adrian met her gaze steadily. That is possible. But when powerful people believe a mistake is true, they rarely wait long to confirm it. Clara felt the first real hint of concern settle in her chest. Why are you telling me this? Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer and lowered his voice slightly, so that only she could hear him. Because in less than 24 hours, someone is going to try to find you. Clara stared at him in disbelief. And you know this how? Adrian's expression remained calm, but there was something serious behind his eyes now, something that made his next words sound less like a suggestion and more like a decision that had already been made. Because the only solution that will keep them from reaching you has already been arranged. Clara stared at Adrian Russo in the quiet hallway of the office building, trying to understand the meaning behind his calm certainty, but the more she thought about his words, the less sense the situation seemed to make. The only solution has already been arranged, he had said, as if he were discussing a scheduled meeting rather than the safety of someone he barely knew. Clara took a slow breath and shook her head slightly. I think you are mistaken, she said carefully. I am an analyst who spends most of her day reviewing numbers and contracts. No one is searching for me. Adrian listened without interrupting, his expression patient but unchanged. When she finished speaking, he simply reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a thin folder. He held it out to her without urgency. Clara hesitated for a moment before taking it, unsure whether she even wanted to know what he had brought. The folder contained several printed pages, each one showing fragments of financial records and transaction logs. At first the numbers meant nothing to her, but then she noticed a small detail that made her stomach tighten. Her name appeared in the margin of a report she had reviewed weeks earlier, connected to a financial transfer she had flagged for clarification during a routine audit. Clara looked up slowly. "This transfer was unusual," she said. "That is why I marked it for review." Adrian nodded once. "Exactly." Clara flipped through another page, her confusion deepening. "These transactions involved several shell companies," she continued, thinking aloud now. "But that still does not explain why anyone would be looking for me." Adrian's voice remained calm. "Because the transfer you flagged was not simply unusual. It exposed a connection between organizations that prefer to remain invisible." Clara felt the quiet office hallway suddenly seem much smaller. "I only reviewed the numbers," she said. "I did not accuse anyone of anything." "That distinction does not always matter," Adrian replied gently. Clara closed the folder slowly, trying to process the implication. "If someone believes I discovered something important, then they should speak with my firm, not me personally." Adrian shook his head again. "That would be the reasonable approach. Unfortunately, the people involved are not known for reasonable approaches." Clara looked down at the folder again, the printed numbers now carrying a meaning she had not noticed before. "So what happens next?" she asked quietly. Adrian answered without hesitation. "They will begin searching for the person who reviewed that record." Clara's voice grew sharper. "Then I will explain that I only asked a question about a financial report." Adrian's gaze remained steady. "Clara," he said carefully, "you asked the right question in the wrong place." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the office lights filled the silence while Clara tried to understand the scale of what Adrian was suggesting. Finally she looked back up at him. "And this solution you mentioned," she said slowly, "what exactly does it involve?" Adrian did not smile. He simply met her eyes and spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome long before arriving at the building. "It involves making sure that anyone who starts looking for Clara Bennett finds someone who is already under my protection." Clara held the folder against her chest for a moment, as if the printed pages inside had suddenly become heavier than paper should be. The quiet hallway around them felt different now, as though the ordinary office building she walked through every day had quietly shifted into a place filled with questions she could no longer ignore. She looked up at Adrian Russo again, studying the calm expression on his face. The idea that someone might be searching for her still felt impossible, but Adrian did not look like a man who made dramatic statements without reason. "Under your protection," she repeated slowly, trying to understand what that actually meant. Adrian nodded once, his posture relaxed, but his attention fully focused on her reaction. "Yes." Clara exhaled softly and shook her head. "I appreciate the warning, but I am not someone who needs protection. I have a normal life, a small apartment, and a job that involves spreadsheets and meetings. No one is going to start a search operation for a financial analyst." Adrian listened quietly, allowing her to finish before answering. "Clara," he said calmly, "you are correct about one thing. Your life was normal until the moment your name appeared on that report." The past tense in his sentence made her pause. "Was normal," she repeated. Adrian gave a slight nod. "Yes." Clara felt the tension in her shoulders tighten. "So what exactly does protection from you involve?" Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the large window at the end of the hallway, where the late afternoon sunlight reflected off the glass buildings across the street. When he spoke again, his voice remained quiet but certain. "It involves changing the way people see your situation." Clara frowned slightly. "I do not follow." Adrian turned back to face her fully. "Right now, if someone begins looking for Clara Bennett, they will find an ordinary woman with no connections and no protection. That makes you an easy target for questions." Clara crossed her arms again. "And you want to change that?" Adrian's response was simple. "Exactly." Clara studied him carefully. "So what are you suggesting?" Adrian met her gaze without hesitation. "I am suggesting that when anyone looks for Clara Bennett, they discover that she is already connected to someone they would prefer not to challenge." Clara blinked, slowly realizing what he was implying. "You want people to think I work for you." Adrian shook his head once. "That would not be enough." Clara felt a quiet sense of disbelief rising in her chest. "Then what exactly would be enough?" Adrian answered with the same steady tone he had used since the conversation began. Something official. Something public. Something that clearly establishes that you are under my protection in a way no one will question. Clara stared at him, the meaning beginning to settle in piece by piece. And how do you plan to create something like that in less than 24 hours? Adrian's expression remained calm as he spoke the words that would change the direction of her life completely. By arranging a legal connection that no one in this city will ignore. Clara felt the hallway fall silent around them. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she finally asked the question forming in her mind. What kind of legal connection? Adrian did not hesitate. Marriage, he said quietly. Tomorrow. Clara Bennett stared at Adrian Russo as the single word settled in the quiet hallway like a shock that refused to fade. Marriage. Tomorrow. For a moment, she wondered if she had misheard him, if the calm certainty in his voice had disguised something else entirely, but Adrian's expression remained unchanged. He was not joking. He was not testing her reaction. He was simply stating a plan that already existed in his mind. Clara shook her head slowly, letting out a breath that sounded half disbelief and half frustration. That is not a solution, she said firmly. That is a completely unreasonable proposal. Adrian did not react to the sharpness in her voice. His posture remained relaxed, as though this conversation was unfolding exactly as he expected. It is the most effective solution, he replied calmly. Clara stepped back slightly, trying to process the idea. You cannot just walk into someone's workplace and suggest marriage like you were scheduling a meeting, she said. People do not solve problems that way. Adrian met her gaze with quiet patience. Most people do not face the type of problem you are facing. Clara felt irritation rise in her chest. I am not marrying someone I barely know because of a financial report. Adrian tilted his head slightly, studying her with that same careful attention she remembered from their first meeting months earlier. Clara, he said quietly, you do not need to know me. You only need to understand how the situation will appear to others. Clara crossed her arms again. And how exactly will it appear? Adrian answered without hesitation. It will appear that Clara Bennett is no longer an independent financial analyst who accidentally discovered something inconvenient. Instead, she will appear to be the wife of Adrian Russo. Clara exhaled sharply. That still does not explain why anyone would care. Adrian's voice remained steady. Because people who might consider questioning you will reconsider once they realize that questioning you means challenging me. Clara searched his face, trying to understand the logic behind the calm certainty in his tone. You are asking me to change my entire life overnight, she said quietly. Adrian did not argue with the statement. Yes. Clara let out a small laugh that carried no humor. And you expect me to agree to this within 24 hours? Adrian paused before answering. And for the first time since the conversation began, there was something almost reflective in his expression. No, he said softly. I expect you to understand that this decision is not about convenience. Clara studied him carefully. Then what is it about? Adrian held her gaze with steady focus. It is about survival. The word hung between them for a moment before Clara spoke again. If this is truly necessary, she said slowly, then why me? Adrian's answer came without hesitation. Because you are already involved whether you wanted to be or not. Clara looked down at the folder in her hands again, the printed pages suddenly feeling like the first step in a chain of events she had never intended to start. When she finally looked back up at Adrian, her voice was quieter than before. And if I refuse? Adrian did not raise his voice. He simply spoke with the calm honesty that had marked every sentence since he arrived. Then we will find another way to protect you. Clara waited a moment before asking the question she had not expected to care about. And would that way be as effective as the one you just suggested? Adrian held her gaze for several seconds before answering honestly. No. Clara Bennett stood motionless in the hallway long after Adrian Russo finished speaking, the quiet certainty of his answer echoing through her thoughts. No. The word had been simple, direct, and completely free of hesitation. It was the first time during their conversation that she truly understood how serious he was. Adrian was not presenting options the way ordinary people discuss difficult decisions. He was outlining probabilities, and the one he believed would keep her safest was the one he had already chosen. Clara slowly exhaled and looked toward the window at the end of the corridor where the late afternoon sun reflected off rows of glass towers stretching across Manhattan. For years she had lived a quiet life built on careful routines. She paid her bills on time. She worked long hours reviewing financial statements that most people never bothered to read. She had never imagined that a single question about a suspicious transfer would place her in a hallway listening to a man calmly suggest marriage as a form of protection. She turned back toward Adrian, studying him more carefully than she had during their earlier meetings. Up close, he looked exactly the same as he had in the conference room months ago. His posture was relaxed, his expression thoughtful, and his voice carried the same measured calm that made every sentence sound deliberate. There was no pressure in his tone, no attempt to convince her emotionally. Instead, he simply stood there waiting, as though he understood that the weight of the decision could not be rushed. Clara finally spoke again. "Let us assume for a moment that I believe everything you just told me," she said slowly. "Let us assume that someone really is searching for the person connected to that report." Adrian nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. Clara tightened her grip on the folder in her hands. "Even if that is true, you are asking me to walk into a public ceremony with a man I barely know and pretend that we belong together." Adrian answered quietly. "Not pretend. Legally establish it." Clara looked at him with disbelief. "You say that like it is a simple paperwork arrangement." Adrian remained calm. "In many ways it is." Clara shook her head. "Marriage is not paperwork." Adrian considered her response before answering. "In this situation, it is protection disguised as paperwork." Clara let out a quiet breath, realizing how carefully he had framed every part of the plan. "You have already organized this, have you not?" she asked. Adrian did not deny it. "Preparations are possible if you choose to accept." Clara stared at him for a moment before asking the question that had begun to matter more than she expected. "Why are you willing to do this for someone you barely know?" Adrian paused before responding, and for the first time his answer carried something more personal than strategy. "Because you asked the right question when no one else in that room was willing to ask it," he said. Clara blinked, surprised by the simplicity of the explanation. Adrian continued calmly. "People who choose honesty over comfort are rare. I prefer not to see them punished for it." Clara felt a strange mixture of frustration and reluctant respect forming in her thoughts. She had always trusted logic more than emotion, and the logic of the situation was becoming harder to ignore. If what Adrian said was true, then the decision she faced was not between marriage and freedom. It was between preparation and uncertainty. Clara looked down at the folder one last time before lifting her eyes back to Adrian Russo. "If I agree to this arrangement," she said quietly, "then we do it with one condition." Adrian's expression remained calm but attentive. "Name it." Clara met his gaze directly. "When this situation is over, we go back to being strangers." Adrian Russo listened to Clara Bennett's condition without interrupting, his expression remaining calm as if he had already anticipated that she would set a boundary before agreeing to anything that changed the course of her life so suddenly. The hallway around them remained quiet, the muted hum of office lights the only sound between them as the final seconds of her decision settled into the air. "When this situation is over, we go back to being strangers." Clara had spoken the words carefully, not with anger, but with the clear logic of someone determined to keep control over at least one part of a situation that already felt far too large. Adrian studied her for a moment before giving a small nod. "That is reasonable," he said quietly. Clara watched him closely, searching his face for any sign that he was simply agreeing to move the conversation forward. "You accept that condition?" she asked. Adrian answered with the same calm certainty he had shown from the beginning. "Yes." Clara felt a small measure of tension ease in her shoulders, although the reality of what they had just agreed to still felt almost impossible to believe. A marriage arranged in less than 24 hours. A public ceremony designed not for romance, but for protection. She had spent most of her life believing that decisions should be made slowly, carefully, after weighing every possible outcome. Now she was standing in a hallway preparing to agree to something that would become official before the next day ended. She glanced down at the folder one more time, then handed it back to Adrian. "If we are doing this," she said quietly, "then we do it clearly. No secrets." Adrian accepted the folder without hesitation. "Agreed." Clara folded her arms again, focusing on the practical side of the situation because it was easier than thinking about the emotional implications. "What happens next?" Adrian answered immediately, as though the schedule had already been prepared long before this conversation began. Tonight you will pack what you need for several days. Tomorrow morning you will meet me at St. Matthew's Cathedral at 10 o'clock. Clara raised an eyebrow slightly. A cathedral? Adrian nodded once. A private ceremony. With a limited number of witnesses. Clara considered the image in her mind. A wedding taking place before noon with guests she had never met. And after that, Adrian's voice remained steady. After that you will be legally recognized as my wife. Clara looked at him for a moment before asking the question she had been holding back since the beginning of their conversation. And once people believe that connection is real, they will stop searching for answers. Adrian's response was simple. Most of them will. Clara noticed the careful wording. Most. She exhaled slowly. That means this will not solve everything. Adrian met her gaze calmly. It will solve the most immediate problem. Clara nodded once, accepting the logic even if she did not like how complicated the situation had become. She had always believed that honesty was the safest approach to any problem. Now she was about to step into a public marriage built on strategy instead of emotion. Clara looked toward the window one last time before turning back to Adrian Russo. All right, she said quietly. Tomorrow morning. Adrian gave a slight nod of acknowledgement, but his voice carried a quiet seriousness as he spoke again. Clara, he said calmly, once this ceremony happens the world will see you differently. Clara met his gaze without hesitation. That is fine, she replied. As long as the world also remembers that this was your idea. Clara Bennett barely remembered leaving the office building that afternoon. The conversation with Adrian Russo had ended calmly, almost quietly, but the decision they reached echoed through her thoughts with every step she took toward the subway station. New York moved around her in its usual rhythm, taxis rolling past in steady lines, pedestrians crossing streets while holding coffee cups and phones, the sound of distant sirens blending into the constant hum of the city. To everyone else it was just another ordinary evening in Manhattan. But for Clara nothing felt ordinary anymore. She reached her apartment in Brooklyn shortly after sunset and stood inside the doorway for a long moment before turning on the lights. The small space looked exactly the same as it always had. A modest kitchen table near the window, a stack of unopened mail on the counter, a bookshelf filled with financial textbooks, and a few novels she had promised herself she would read once work slowed down. Everything in the apartment reflected the careful life she had built for herself, predictable and steady. Tomorrow morning that life would change in a way she had never imagined. Clara moved slowly through the apartment, gathering the few things Adrian had suggested she bring for the next several days. A suitcase rested open on the bed while she placed a few changes of clothes inside, her movements mechanical as she tried to focus on the practical details rather than the reality of what she had agreed to. She paused for a moment when her phone lit up on the nightstand. The screen showed a message from an unfamiliar number. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, St. Matthew's Cathedral. The message contained nothing else, but she knew exactly who had sent it. Clara set the phone down again and looked around the room. For years, she had believed that control over her life came from careful planning and responsible choices. Now she was preparing to attend her own wedding less than 24 hours after hearing the proposal. Yet the strangest part was that she no longer felt as uncertain as she had earlier that afternoon. Adrian Russo had never tried to pressure her emotionally. He had simply explained the situation with calm honesty and left the decision in her hands. That honesty had been the one thing she trusted. Clara closed the suitcase and sat down on the edge of the bed, staring quietly at the wall across the room. She remembered the way Adrian had looked at her in the hallway, not with impatience, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood the consequences of every choice he made. He had offered protection in the most unusual way imaginable, but he had never pretended that the arrangement was anything other than strategic. Clara finally stood up and walked to the window overlooking the street below. Cars moved past beneath the glow of streetlights while people hurried along the sidewalks wrapped in coats against the cool evening air. Tomorrow she would walk into a cathedral beside a man she barely knew and legally become his wife. It was not a decision she had ever expected to make, but it was the only one that made sense now. Clara turned away from the window and switched off the light beside her bed. Tomorrow morning, she thought quietly, everything would begin. Clara Bennett arrived at St. Matthew's Cathedral just before 10 o'clock the next morning, the tall stone building rising above the quiet Manhattan street, like something far older than the city surrounding it. The early sunlight reflected against the stained glass windows, casting soft colors across the entrance steps as she paused outside for a moment with her small suitcase beside her. The air felt cooler than the night before, carrying the calm stillness of a morning that had not yet fully awakened. For a brief moment, Clara allowed herself to simply stand there, taking in the quiet before the next chapter of her life began. Yesterday, she had been an analyst reviewing financial reports. Today she was about to walk into a wedding arranged less than 24 hours earlier. The cathedral doors opened quietly before she reached for them, and a man in a dark suit stepped aside with a respectful nod. "Miss Bennett," he said calmly, "Mr. Russo is expecting you." Clara recognized immediately that the man was part of Adrian's security team. She gave a small nod in return and stepped inside. The interior of the cathedral was calm and nearly empty, sunlight filtering through the stained glass in long ribbons of color across the polished stone floor. A few quiet figures stood near the front of the room, speaking softly among themselves. Clara recognized none of them, but their posture and formal clothing suggested they were here as witnesses rather than guests. Adrian Russo stood near the front row, his back partially turned as he spoke with the priest. Even from across the room, his presence was unmistakable. He wore a dark suit that matched the calm authority he carried so naturally, and when he turned toward the entrance, his attention immediately found Clara standing near the doors. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Adrian walked toward her with the same steady confidence she had noticed from the beginning, stopping a few feet away before offering a polite nod. "Good morning, Clara." His tone was calm, almost formal, but there was a quiet awareness behind his eyes that suggested he had been watching the entrance for some time. Clara glanced around the nearly empty cathedral again before returning her attention to him. "This is happening faster than I imagined," she said quietly. Adrian nodded once. That was the intention. Clara studied him carefully, noticing how composed he remained despite the unusual nature of the situation. "You arranged all of this overnight?" Adrian answered simply. "Most of the arrangements were already prepared in case you agreed." Clara could not help raising an eyebrow slightly at that admission. "You were confident I would say yes." Adrian's expression remained thoughtful. "I was confident you would choose the option that made the most logical sense." Clara considered that answer for a moment before letting out a quiet breath. "Logic has never led me to a cathedral before." Adrian allowed the faintest hint of a smile before it disappeared again. "Life rarely follows the same equations as financial reports." Clara looked toward the front of the cathedral, where the priest now waited patiently beside the altar. The quiet space felt almost surreal, as though the ceremony about to happen belonged to someone else's life rather than her own. When she turned back to Adrian Russo, her voice carried a calm determination that had guided every decision she made so far. "All right," she said softly. "Let us finish what we started yesterday." Clara Bennett walked beside Adrian Russo toward the front of the cathedral, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished stone floor as the quiet witnesses turned their attention toward them. The priest offered a welcoming nod as they approached the altar, his calm presence adding a sense of ceremony to a moment that still felt strangely unreal to Clara. Everything about the setting looked exactly like a traditional wedding. The tall arches above them filtered the morning light into soft colors that drifted across the marble floor, and the faint scent of polished wood and candles lingered in the still air. Yet despite the beauty of the cathedral, Clara could not forget that the reason for this ceremony was not romance or celebration, but a careful decision made less than a day earlier. She stood beside Adrian and folded her hands in front of her, steadying her breathing as the priest began speaking the familiar words that had joined countless couples before them. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Adrian Russo and Clara Bennett." Clara glanced briefly toward Adrian as the ceremony continued. He stood with the same calm composure she had come to expect, his posture relaxed yet attentive, as though he understood the significance of every word even, though the circumstances behind them were far from traditional. When the priest asked them to face one another, Clara turned fully toward Adrian and met his gaze. For a moment the cathedral seemed to grow quieter, the distant sounds of the city fading into the background. Adrian looked exactly as he always did, controlled and thoughtful, but there was also a quiet seriousness in his expression that told Clara he understood the weight of the promise they were about to make. The priest spoke again, his voice gentle and steady. Marriage is not only a legal bond, but a commitment to stand beside one another in times of uncertainty and challenge. Clara almost smiled at the irony of the statement, considering that uncertainty had been the very reason they stood here now. When the priest asked if she accepted Adrian Russo as her husband, Clara paused for a brief moment before answering. I do. Her voice sounded calmer than she expected. Adrian answered the same question with equal clarity. I do. The priest nodded and reached for the simple gold rings resting on a small velvet cushion beside him. Adrian lifted one of the rings and carefully placed it on Clara's finger. The metal felt cool against her skin, a quiet symbol of a decision that had changed the direction of her life in less than 24 hours. Clara then took the second ring and slid it onto Adrian's hand, noticing how steady her own hands had become. The priest looked at them both and offered a warm smile. By the authority given to me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Clara heard the quiet murmur of acknowledgement from the witnesses behind them as the words settled into the air. Adrian turned slightly toward her, his expression thoughtful but calm, as though the moment had unfolded exactly as planned. Clara looked down briefly at the ring on her finger, realizing that the arrangement they had discussed in a hallway only yesterday was now an official part of the world's records. When she looked back at Adrian Russo again, she understood that whatever happened next would no longer involve two strangers making a temporary agreement. From this moment forward, the world would see them as something else entirely. The quiet murmur of the witnesses slowly faded as the ceremony came to an end, leaving Clara Bennett standing beside Adrian Russo beneath the tall arches of St. Matthew's Cathedral with a strange sense of calm settling over her thoughts. Only 24 hours earlier she had been sitting in her office reviewing financial documents, believing her life would continue along the same careful path she had always followed. Now she stood wearing a simple gold ring that symbolized a marriage arranged in a single day, a decision made not by romance, but by logic and necessity. The priest offered a final warm blessing before stepping aside, allowing the witnesses to quietly gather their coats and move toward the cathedral doors. Within a few minutes the large room returned to its earlier stillness, leaving Clara and Adrian standing together near the altar with only the soft echo of their footsteps remaining in the air. Clara glanced down briefly at the ring on her hand again before looking up at Adrian. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it carried the quiet understanding that the arrangement they had discussed so carefully had now become a permanent record. Adrian finally broke the silence with the same calm tone he had used since the beginning of this unusual situation. Are you all right, Clara? She considered the question honestly before answering. I think I am still trying to understand how everything happened so quickly. Adrian nodded once, as though that reaction was completely expected. The first days of change often feel that way, he said. Clara looked toward the tall, stained glass windows, watching the colors of the morning light shift slowly across the stone floor. Yesterday we were strangers discussing a problem in a hallway, she said quietly. Now the world believes we are married. Adrian's voice remained thoughtful. The world believes what it sees. Clara turned her attention back to him. And what do you believe? Adrian paused briefly before answering. I believe you made the most logical choice available to you. Clara could not help letting out a small laugh at the simplicity of the answer. That sounds more like a financial analysis than a wedding reflection. Adrian allowed a faint smile to appear for just a moment. Perhaps. Clara stood quietly for a few seconds, considering everything that had led to this moment. She had always trusted clear thinking and honest decisions, and despite the unusual path that brought her here, she still believed. She had chosen the option that made the most sense. Eventually she spoke again, her voice calm but direct. Our agreement still stands, she reminded him. When this situation ends, we return to being strangers. Adrian met her gaze with the same steady focus he had shown from the beginning. Yes, he said quietly. Clara nodded once, accepting the answer. Outside the cathedral doors the city continued its endless motion, unaware that a marriage built on strategy rather than romance had just taken place inside the quiet stone walls. Clara looked at the ring on her finger one last time before turning toward the exit beside Adrian Russo. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing with complete certainty. The life she had known yesterday was already part of the past.